All right, today we're going to talk about some of the challenges that countries, nations in the world faces with sustainable development, and some of the things folks are doing to address those challenges. So, the key part of sustainable development is really trying to um, figure out how we can balance the needs we have for food, housing, clothing, medicine, and all the other consumptive practices that we have with the preservation of the natural world and those ecosystem services that it provides for us, so we can move forward with satisfying our needs, making sure people have the human welfare that they need and quality of lives that they need, while still maintaining other species. So there's a lot of different policies and ways that policies can be enacted and work for conservation. We're going to focus a lot on some of the things that go more in like less preserved areas, so not like wildlife refuges and national parks, although those fit in with conservation policies. Because really, there's more different types of policies than you could even discuss in an entire course, and I'm sure there's some ways to get a whole class out of that. But designating wildlife areas, is one way that happens. The book had an example of a state wildlife area. The Anchorage Alaska Department of Fish and Game manages the Anchorage Coastal Wildlife Refuge, and then there's various rules set up for these various types of public lands. The example up at the upper right is Nancy Lake State Park, and you see the snowmobile status is what I draw your attention to. The state park has a limit on snow machine use, and snow machine use is only allowed when you have a certain amount of snow on the ground to protect the vegetation. That's one of the regulations that comes about with utilizing this state park, and that helps to act as a conservation policy for that area. So there's various rules that can happen on public lands, and then there's also conservations of specific types of habitats like wetlands and grasslands. Wetlands is actually a huge one, as well as waterways, as people recognize the importance of those in the broader scheme of things with both pollution and biodiversity. So there's a bunch of different practices that are brought up in the book, and we'll kind of go through each of these. There's leasing, which are contract payments for landowners. The big difference between leasing and some of these other things that are payments for landowners is that leasing is set up over a period of time, just like leasing an apartment. You have a year lease, 5-year lease. Some examples of these are programs through things like the Natural Resource Conservation Service, which I'll bring up quite a bit. They are part of the USDA, and they have things like wetland reserve programs or conservation reserve programs, where large landowners can take and put in reserve these areas, and in return they get payments for the management that they do on those to maintain them. Banking is kind of a landowner preservation of the land. They may be able to take a portion of their land that they manage and own and designate it as a wetland or a critical habitat for an endangered species, if it was proven that it really was, and then actually get things like tax relief and things like that based off of that. Development is a strategy where part of a land is developed and the other part is maintained for that habitat. It's kind of a push-pull or give-take portion of something when we need a development on a particular habitat that's really unique or has value for an endangered species, and some of it gets developed, but some remainder must be protected. Sometimes those things are done outside of the area where that development occurred. So kind of taking a wetland and developing a building or store, parking lot on that wetland, and then having to make payments to help with preservation of wetlands elsewhere. landowners can also be paid for having conservation practices on their land, such as like carbon credits and things like that. If they're managing a land or helping pay to manage a land elsewhere, the landowner can get credits. Those carbon credits can be traded or used to offset their credits, or they might even get cash payments. Concessions are an interesting one, and one that was new to me. It's where conservation organizations are actually starting to raise enough funds to start to outbid extraction, and that's just kind of an interesting way of conservation happening. Although it does stop development and might actually create a little bit of a competition between organizations, conservation organizations and extraction. There's also a lot of land trusts that are out there. These are kind of similar to some of these other tactics. And this figure shows various land trusts locations across the country, the United States, and then whether or not there are ownerships, easements, some sort of restrictions, or otherwise transferred. So conservation easements, mentioned these briefly a little while ago. There are a variety of programs in the U.S. with different agencies. The two that jump out at me the most are Natural Resource Conservation Service. Like I previously mentioned, they have programs like Wetland Reserve, Conservation Reserve Program, Grassland Reserve Programs, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as well. When we have these easements set up, they can, depending on what is going on and how they intend to protect, they might allow or not allow various types of activities. So things like a timber harvest easement, there's certain percentages of them that allow so certain types of easements might actually allow things like timber harvest, or they may prohibit it. It just varies across the board as you start to look into these easements and what each one allows to do. So it's supposed to make sort of a fit for the landowner, so that they can still profit and benefit from the land, but also benefit from the conservation practice as much as possible. Conservation payments, the book uses this example of these Saurus cranes in northern plains of Cambodia, and they had areas where they were protected, and folks put in the protection, were paid for protecting these bird nests, and versus those that weren't, and so they see a big success in fledgling development of these birds when they're protected. There's some other government approaches out there, such as that usually come out in things like regulations and controlling borders and other laws like the Endangered Species Act. The regulations can protect specific habitats. It brought up wetlands a few times. The EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers regulates wetlands through permits, and there's a lot of things that even a private landowner in the United States can't do in a wetland without having a permit and the permissions and getting all of those things in order so that wetlands in general are protected. There's controlling borders like CITES, that's the International Agreement on the Trade in Endangered Species, and so groups like the Customs and Border Protection actually enforce this by searching through bags and shipments into different countries and making sure that those things don't have endangered species or parts of endangered species, products made from endangered species in them. They also do Customs and Border Protection, a lot of other things at our borders to protect biodiversity and habitats, like managing invasive species as well. They intercept invasive species on ships and cargo coming in from other parts of the world. In Alaska, this has been happened several times with something called a spongy moth. It's a defoliating moth that comes from Asia and Europe, and they've detected the egg masses on these before, and those moths are known to basically devastate forests where they get introduced. So countries, when they start to act together, really start to make conservation move forward quicker and better. And there's a lot of different examples out there of agreements, and we'll talk briefly about a few of those. You don't really need to know each agreement inside and out, but the basics of them is that when these parties sign on to an agreement, they're oftentimes not necessarily legally binding, though a country may impose sanctions and stuff if folks break on an agreement. But it's not necessarily true across many of these conservation agreements. But they are used to help drive the policies of those individual nations as things start to move forward. There are definitely some things like CITES and things like that that probably have a bit more teeth than other ones that we will talk about. But this graphic here basically shows that over time, from 1970 to 2020, or 2000 and probably 18 by this graphic, the number of parties, number of nations that are signing on to these agreements is steadily increasing, and that just goes to show how much the conservation organizations are coordinating and together. And here's another example of agreement, COP24, the Conference of Parties, an international meeting that held in Poland. They talk about ecology, climate, and a variety of other things to keep us moving forward. Big, huge focus is often climate change for a lot of these international agreements and international efforts towards conservation. So there's 7 major biodiversity-related international agreements. There's the Convention on Biological Diversity that promotes conserving biological diversity, the sustainable use and sharing the benefits. CITES, that Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and we mentioned that already, keeping species that are endangered from being traded across borders. We have the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals, set up for birds primarily that migrate across borders and long distances to make sure that the conservation actions that happen in Canada complement those that happen in the U.S. and Mexico, and where some of these range even further. Recently I read the Arctic tern has the largest, actually goes all the way from up here in Alaska down to the southern South America, largest migration of any bird. The Ramsar Convention of Wetland, promoting wetland conservation, and various others, plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, and the World Heritage Convention, among a few more, to try to, World Heritage Convention actually trying to preserve kind of specific areas that are very unique and provide value to people as well as wildlife. So there's under these we can get international help then for individual countries on helping set up bird sanctuaries. For example, this is a World Heritage Site as well. Down in it's the Iguaca Falls in Brazil, and these can be conserved, and then through these agreements, international participation in conservation of these is taken apart. And there's also a lot of across borders, especially with countries that are sharing borders, that work to create parks that are interconnected either directly at the borders or with the with rivers that connect them. And so this is an example of the Transfrontier, Greater Limpopo Transfrontier Park, and that's South Africa, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe that are partnering to connect these parks. And you can imagine with a lot of the large animals that still live in Africa that that sort of connection is really important. So there's a variety of sources of funding that are used in conservation. Oftentimes, a lot of the funding that goes into conservation is domestic budgets. These things are what in the U.S. feed into programs like the that we already mentioned, like from the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Wetland Reserve, etc. But also going into managing national parks and other things. There's green agriculture subsidies that are out there and in place. Those may overlap a bit with things like the conservation programs for wetlands, but also farmers in the U.S. have been paid for years to start to enact programs. They're not necessarily paid, but are subsidized, and sometimes are able to get grants and assistance in implementing things like no-till agriculture to help preserve soils, or utilizing weed control practices to control invasive species. There's various other programs out there as well. And again, these programs vary widely across the globe. And one of the types of assistance that's brought on by developed countries to help developing countries with their conservation strategies is this official development assistance program. And this is a graphic that shows just the amount of money that's gone into those over the years. You can see a little bit of a drop from 2015 to 16, but those are billions of US dollars, and those are contributed by a variety of different countries to these programs, and it's meant to help developing countries continue their development, but actually enact conservation strategies as well. So the contributions to this then by the different countries is shown here, and you can see there's a variety of different places that are contributing, and from their different colors. It looks like the United States is up there towards the top, and then Japan is also giving a bit of funding as well. There's some other countries like France that are building quite a bit up in the now, in Germany in recent years, that are really starting to increase their contributions as well. Now, within a lot of these, the international aid, though, can also end up helping support projects that are actually detrimental to biodiversity and conservation. And in conservation circles, they label this as kind of perverse subsidies, and those are increasing extractions of fossil fuels, water use and treatment, agricultural production, and fisheries. And it gets controversial because these countries need to be able to develop these resources, and so some of that aid ends up going that way, but hopefully enough of it gets into conservation as well so that those things balance. Of course, that's not always the case. Interestingly, non-governmental organizations, their contribution is also on the rise, and so their funding is often coming from philanthropy and donations from people, both like you and I, but also really rich people providing funding to World Wildlife Fund, Sierra Club, and others. And you can see that these revenues that these groups have are increasing, and so their conservation impact can also increase as those go up. Now, we mentioned in here one of your learning objectives is to identify for your projects the sources of funding that could benefit that. All of you have such different projects, it can vary based on each individual one, from things like programs for the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or even more local programs than that. There may be funding available on the state or county level, all the way up to these things that might be provided by NGOs. So give it some thought and some research, and take it from there.